Get me a beer!
One day, my 21-year-old stepson, Norman, came back from his birthday party, threw his suit on the floor, relaxed on the sofa, and loudly ordered me around. My husband, apparently planning to celebrate Norman's adulthood, was sitting at the table in front of the sofa. When I brought them the beer, they both started mocking me with laughter.
Seriously, you should bring it right away without being told. You're totally useless. It's laughable that you think you're a mother. Even the cleaning lady at my office is more useful. You'd get fired in no time if this were a job. Hearing my husband's true feelings, I made up my mind to act on what I had been keeping in my heart and went back to my room. In that case, you can fire me. Thank you for everything. Here's my resignation letter. When I returned to them, I handed them my signed divorce papers. I don't care. Norman is an adult now, so you're not needed anymore. Apparently, neither of them cared about the divorce. 30 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Oh, my ride is here. Goodbye then. What? Your ride? Why are you here?
My husband, apparently planning to celebrate Norman's adulthood, was sitting at the table in front of the sofa. My name is Claire. I grew up with my mother after my parents divorced when I was little. Looking back now, I have almost no happy memories from that time. We were never well off, and my mom worked multiple part-time jobs from morning till night, so we never had any family time. At school, I was often teased for having a single parent, and my days were filled with sadness and loneliness. Even so, I knew my mom was working hard, and I tried to be cheerful at home so as not to trouble her. My mom seemed to understand this and would buy me a big cake on my birthday to make me feel less lonely. Seeing my mom like that made me resent my father more and more for abandoning us. After high school, while my friends went on to college, I chose to work instead to help with the household finances and not burden my mom any further. I worked desperately every day, and by the time I was in my 30s and life had finally settled down, I decided to join a city mixer to give my mom some peace of mind. That's where I met my current husband, David. David was a confident man, an employee at a major company who boasted that he was promised an executive position in the future. He had a young son, Norman, from his previous marriage and an elderly mother. When we got married, he asked me to take care of them. My mom was against it, fearing I was taking on too much, but having worked hard since high school, I admired David's confidence. Ignoring my mom's objections, I got married and started living with Norman and my mother-in-law. Years passed, and now in my 40s with no children of my own, I found myself struggling more with Norman, who had become increasingly delinquent since becoming a teenager. He spent his days at arcades or playing game at home, not studying, and even started stealing money from my wallet and selling my belongings online without permission. I scolded him, saying, "It's wrong to sell family items without permission." But his response was harsh. "What? Don't act like family when you're not my mom, you old hag." Norman's abusive words made it clear he never saw me as his mother. Since the day we met, he never called me mom but always addressed me as Claire. What started as a concern when he was in elementary school turned into outright disdain. However, my husband and mother-in-law were always indifferent, never reprimanding Norman even when I told them he was stealing money. One day, another concern was added to my worries. "It's about time we worried about my mom, don't you think? You're at work during the day, and it's worrisome to leave her alone." My husband said suddenly while we were in bed. "True, she did mention she's been falling more often in the hallway lately." "Yeah. So, I want you to quit your job and take care of my mom." "What? Wait a minute. That's impossible. I've been at that job for so long. What's more important, your job or my mom?" My husband, ignoring his own responsibilities, refused to listen, and I ended up having to quit the job I'd had since high school. After some persuasion, I managed to take a leave of absence instead, dedicating myself to caring for my mother-in-law. However, she started taking advantage of my care, delegating even the smallest tasks to me. all the household chores that we had previously shared now fell solely on me. Not only that, but she frequently made me prepare tea and insisted I buy specific snacks that we didn't keep at home, treating me like a maid. Even though she wasn't bedridden, I hinted that she could move around a bit, but she insulted me, saying, "What a useless maid you are, talking back like that." This treatment continued even in front of my husband and Norman, and when I looked to them for help, they said, "Taking care of her is your job," and offered no assistance. Looking back, just as Norman never treated me as a mother, my mother-in-law never treated me as a daughter-in-law. Any deviation or insufficiency in household chores would result in her yelling at me. We had divided chores reluctantly because we both worked, but now that I wasn't working, she felt free to fully exploit me. Even when it came to raising Norman, she blamed me, saying, "It's because you're not doing your job right," and placed all the responsibility on me. Thinking I had to live like this forever made me feel desperate. However, I had no friends nearby to consult, and I didn't want to trouble my mother, so I endured the abuse alone. Years of this hellish life went by until one day, my mother-in-law suddenly passed away from an illness. While her death was sad, I couldn't help but feel relieved that I was finally free from her torment. However, my struggles were far from over. My husband showed no sadness over his mother's death. Even though his parents were divorced, I thought losing a parent would be more significant. But he left all the funeral arrangements to me under the pretext of work, which I found unbelievable. When I expressed my dissatisfaction, he dismissed it, saying, "It's only natural since you're not working." He maintained a good appearance for the funeral guests, which only deepened my mistrust of him. Soon after, misfortune struck again when I received news that my mother had fallen ill and was hospitalized. I hurriedly prepared to visit her, but my husband said something unbelievable. "What about the housework if you leave? Cleaning? Cooking? What about Norman? You can't just leave the house." Despite my desperate attempts to convince him, he wouldn't allow me to go and even ordered Norman to keep an eye on me to ensure I didn't leave. Tragically, my mother passed away a few days later. While my husband was indifferent to his mother's death, losing my mother was an unbearable sorrow for me. I was filled with regret for not heeding my mother's advice against marriage. My husband reluctantly allowed me to attend the funeral, but once again, he used work as an excuse to refuse to accompany me. What's more unbelievable is that on the night the funeral ended, while I was still in my hometown, my husband called me and yelled, "How long are you going to fool around? Get back here and make dinner." Feeling the cold stares from my relatives, I tearfully returned home, but my mind and body were nearing their breaking point. As I was packing to leave, I was suddenly spoken to from behind. I turned around to see an elderly man who had attended the funeral standing there. I didn't recognize him, so I assumed he was a friend of my mother. But what he said was astonishing. Even after that, my husband and Norman's abuse didn't stop, in fact, it escalated. My husband frequently left home, citing golf and business trips, showing no interest in family matters. No matter what I said, he dismissed me with, "It's the boss's orders, so there's nothing I can do." Even when I was bedridden from exhaustion, he would bring his subordinates home and force me to get up and prepare drinks and snacks. While drunk, he would belittle me in front of his subordinates.
"I'm an executive at my company. You should think about who allows you to live the way you do. You should just serve the house as a maid,"
he would say, laughing loudly. Norman also started to look down on me even more when he entered college. Though he was old enough to live independently with a part-time job, he didn't work and rarely attended school. Instead, he ordered me around for everything. Recently, he even pawned my mother's keepsake jewelry to buy a present for a girl he liked. Naturally, my husband pretended to know nothing about it. To those two, I was nothing more than a robot for doing household chores. I had finally reached my limit. Sobbing in my room, I thought of someone. Seeing my phone in front of me, I instinctively reached for it and called that person. One day, my 21-year-old stepson, Norman, came back from his birthday party, threw his suit on the floor, and relaxed on the sofa.
"Hey, Claire! Get me a beer!"
As usual, Norman loudly ordered me around, and my husband, planning to celebrate Norman's adulthood, was sitting at the table in front of the sofa. When I brought them the beer, they both started mocking me with laughter.
Seriously, you should bring it right away without being told. You're totally useless, thinking you're a mother. You're just a dorm mother, you should only take care of me. You should be grateful for even having the title of mother. That's right. You're already 40 and have lost your charm as a woman, so you should at least be useful. Now that my mom's dead, you can sleep in her room. Sleeping together is pointless.
I silently listened to their continued verbal abuse while making snacks in the kitchen.
You're lucky I married you despite your lack of any notable qualities. I thought you'd at least be useful as a maid, but even the cleaning lady at my office is more useful. You'd be fired right away.
Hearing my husband's complete honesty, I decided to act on what I had been keeping in my heart and went back to my room. In that case, you can fire me. Thank you for everything. Here's my resignation letter. When I returned to them, I handed them my signed divorce papers. I don't care. Norman is an adult now, so you're not needed anymore. My husband scoffed and nonchalantly signed his name on the divorce papers.
What a useless stepmother you turned out to be. Well, you were just a housekeeper, so it doesn't matter.
Norman also showed no sign of regret and just snorted with laughter. As I was packing my things in the room, my husband came in, smirking.
Hey! Want me to give you a ride to the station as a last favor?
I answered without batting an eye.
No, thanks. My family will pick me up.
My cold response seemed to irritate him, and he started to get snarky. Well, family will pick you up, huh? Who's going to pick up someone abandoned by her father and with a dead mother? You're just pretending to be tough, but you have no one to rely on, right? You're just a pathetic old woman. I ignored him and continued preparing to leave.
I've always thought of myself as your father figure. You were an ignorant girl who didn't know a father's love, so as an executive and a reliable man, I took on the role of both husband and father.
You should be grateful. It was laughable how someone who neglected his family for work could say that. Moreover, claiming he had taken on the role of my father without being asked was utterly ridiculous. Does he even realize who helped him reach that executive position? Well, given that such a spineless woman was born, your father must not have been much either. He might already be dead. I would have liked to meet him once as a reference for a worthless man. Once I finished packing, I stood in front of him and smiled.
Oh, really?
Understood.
If you want to see him that badly, I'll show him to you right now.
What? What are you talking about? Your father disappeared after the divorce. Stop with the stupid jokes. He didn't grasp the meaning of my words, but he soon would. About 30 minutes later, the intercom rang. My family is here to pick me up. I quietly stood up, picked up my packed bag, and headed to the front door. Well, I didn't think anyone would actually come. Well, I'll at least see what kind of worthless relative it is. When I opened the door, standing there was my father. My husband, who had followed me, was shocked to see my father's face. President. What brings you here? Why are you at my house? Flustered, my husband hurriedly straightened his disheveled clothes. I'm not the president right now, I'm Claire's father. As her father, should I address you by your name, David? What do you mean by that? What do you mean? Just what I said, David. My husband, shocked into stillness, stopped adjusting his clothes, standing there with mismatched buttons, frozen in place. Yes, the father who had divorced my mother and been missing for years was now the president of the company my husband worked for. It seems my daughter has been well taken care of by you. You've made her work as a maid for quite some time. Though his voice was calm and measured, it was clear he was seething with anger beneath the surface. No, it wasn't like that. A maid, you say? That's a bit of.
Do you know who you have to thank for your current position?
2 years ago, my father's large company absorbed my husband's, resulting in many colleagues being laid off or transferred. However, my husband was promoted to an executive position, favored by the company president, my father. Yes, of course, sir. I became an executive thanks to your recommendation, and I have never forgotten that. Indeed. But I didn't promote you because of your abilities. It was because you were married to Claire. Yet, you've made her cry quite often, haven't you? No, that's not it. I didn't mean to make her cry. Completely intimidated by my father's presence, my husband could do nothing but shrink and sweat nervously. The man who had so arrogantly belittled me was now a mere shadow of himself. I watched in awe as my father, radiating authority, confronted my husband. I had long resented my father for abandoning my mother and me. Working myself to the bone since high school was partly driven by my rebellious spirit against him. I hadn't seen my father since the divorce, but when an elderly man who had attended my mother's funeral introduced himself as my father, I was shocked. I barely remembered his face, so his sudden reappearance was confusing, but he knew a lot about me. Apparently, he had kept track of me through my mother, knowing where I worked and who I married. He had learned from my mother that I harbored deep resentment towards him, so he had kept his distance, watching over me from afar. Coincidentally, his company ended up acquiring the one my husband worked for. By promoting my husband, he hoped to indirectly support me. But when he found out about my husband's abusive phone call the night of my mother's funeral, he decided to help me directly. He revealed his identity and offered his help, saying he wanted to assist me if I was in trouble. Hearing the whole story, my long-held grudge against him softened, and we reconciled after my mother's funeral. I told him everything about the abuse I endured from my husband and stepson. He listened and gave me his contact number, urging me to reach out anytime. The two continued to work on me like a housekeeper robot, and I finally couldn't take their escalating bullying any longer. I called my father for help. That phone call on the night of the funeral made me feel the same way Claire did about you. So, I started paying more attention to your work at the company. What? You monitored my work? My husband flinched, trembling as if in fear. Yes. Do you remember that I sent flowers to your wife on her birthday every year? Yes, I remember. You insisted I give them to her. Indeed. I claimed it was because I wanted to care for my employees' families. But it was really only for Claire, without her knowing. Yes, this was something my father had told me when we met after the funeral. He had been sending flowers through my husband every year on my birthday since becoming the company president, trying to celebrate indirectly. However, I never received those flowers. And you often claimed to be on golf outings or business trips on my orders, but did I ever once give you such orders? I don't recall. No, those trips were. In front of me, you said spending time with your wife was very important, so you wanted to take leave. I thought Claire was being well cared for and felt reassured. Under my father's relentless questioning, my husband could only take the blows, unable to respond. Unable to endure the abuse from my family, I called my father and told him about my husband's constant excuses for neglecting family duties. When I learned from my father that my husband had been taking leave for family reasons and that the golf and business trips were not company orders, my distrust grew even more. I secretly recorded my husband calling me a maid and played it back for my father. So, it seems the fact that you treated Claire as a maid is irrefutable. My husband kept his head down, biting his lip. And when I sensed inconsistencies in your behavior at the company, I asked Claire to hire a detective. A detective? Upon hearing the word detective, my husband looked up, his trembling intensifying, clearly aware of his wrongdoing. I'll let Claire explain. Please, give the report. I nodded quietly and, facing my husband who looked more frightened than I had ever seen him, calmly reported the findings. The investigation revealed that David has had a young mistress for some time. When the detective first told me, I wasn't particularly shocked. After all these years of marriage, I had already resigned myself to being just a maid. And this mistress works as a secretary for a rival company and has been extracting confidential information from David in his executive position. My husband's eyes widened, sweat pouring from his forehead. The flowers my father sent for my birthday were given to this woman as gifts. Finishing my report, I left all further judgment to my father.
Now, David, are you prepared for the consequences?
Under my father's pressure, my husband realized that his dismissal was inevitable. He stood there, pale and trembling, like a criminal awaiting his sentence, which his actions indeed warranted.
What the hell is going on here? Hey, Claire. If we're out of beer, go get some more.
Who's this guy? Sensing the disturbance, Norman staggered drunkenly into the hallway. You're Norman, right? It's not proper to call your mother by her first name.
What? Who the hell are you? Don't stick your nose in our business, old man.
My husband, unable to tolerate Norman's rudeness any longer, slapped him hard across the face.
Ouch! What the hell, Dad? You idiot! Do you know who you're talking to? This man is the president of my company. President, I'm so sorry. My foolish son has been incredibly rude. I'll make sure he understands.
Desperate to avoid being fired, my husband was clearly trying to placate my father, but it was evident that nothing he said would change my father's mind. My father had always been a stubborn man who despised dishonesty, as my mother had often told me.
David, no matter how much you apologize, my decision is final. I no longer have any reason to be addressed as president by you. As of today, you are no longer Claire's husband, and you're also fired from the company. Further actions will be communicated to you in due course.
What? My elite career as an executive. My husband collapsed weakly in the entrance, his face turning even paler.
What do you mean, fired? Dad, you said you'd talk to the president and secure a position for me once I graduated from college. That's why I haven't been job hunting at all. What about my future?
Unlike my pale husband, Norman was furious, his face red with anger. Apparently, they had some secret agreement, but considering their behavior, it was astonishing they could speak like that. Indeed, a terrible father produces a terrible son.
Shut up. That's your problem. Take care of yourself. I'm overwhelmed with my own issues.
Their argument escalated, turning into a physical fight. Claire, let's go. Urged by my father, I finally escaped the house of torment that had plagued me for over 10 years, starting with my mother-in-law. Afterward, my ex-husband, David, was criminally charged for leaking information to a rival company. Norman, who had boasted about becoming an elite employee, found himself abandoned by the women who had flocked to him once news of his father's downfall spread. He began job hunting while working part-time, but without any volunteer or job experience and having always relied on his father, he had no skills or qualifications, resulting in constant rejections. With me gone, no one was left to do the housework, and the house turned into a garbage dump. As for me, I decided to mend the long-standing rift with my father after reconciling due to this incident. I finally learned the reason for my parents' divorce. My mother had been severely mistreated by my grandmother for not bearing a son. Unable to endure it any longer, my mother decided to divorce my father. My father deeply regretted not being able to protect my mother, whom he loved, due to his busy work schedule. Knowing that my mother had also been tormented by her family was shocking, but it explained why she had desperately tried to stop my marriage. However, since my mother's death, my father helped me, leading to our reconciliation. I believe my mother brought us back together. I returned to my long-time job after my divorce. Although my father wanted to hire me as his secretary, I chose to continue my work independently. My father respected my decision and refrains from interfering, except for occasional updates. This time, I will send my father a bouquet for his birthday.